As most of you guys know who are here to listen to me today, the title of my talk is Urban History and Planning the Future. I'm a PhD candidate in history at the University of Maine. And before we start today, I wanted to talk a little bit about this photo, which is the cover of my presentation today. And it's a picture of protesters at Lackland Air Force Base in San Antonio. And it's from a project I did in 2019 that I'm going to be talking about with you guys. As you can see, protesters had gathered to protest at the arrival of JFK to the city in November of 1968. And so you can take a moment to read some of their signs. And I think that this picture is interesting to start with because it asks us to think about the timeline of the end of the civil rights movement, I think, in alternative ways. And as you can see here, that even as late as 1968, San Antonians and Americans in general felt that they were nowhere near the kind of equitable urban reform that they had wanted out of those protest movements. And so it's in the memory of that unfinished legacy that I'd like to orient our discussion today and encourage us to think about longer histories of inequitable urban landscapes and the ways in which deeper rooted issues in dismantling infrastructural racism take combined reconstructive efforts informed by a wide range of professionals, which includes historians. Still remains, how do we dismantle structural racism? About me before we start, I am a doctoral candidate at the University of Maine, and I specialize in 20th century American urban history. The editor of the Maine History Journal, which is an academic journal published by the University of Maine and the Maine Historical Society. And on this page, I've just listed a lecture that you guys might be interested that I did about the converging intellectual movements of feminism in the 20th century and urban planning theory. So that link is up here for you guys. And the second citation I included today is the official publication citation of the research I'll be sharing with you, which was published through Cambridge Scholars Publishing in 2019. So after all of this, if any of you would like to follow up with me about anything we talk about today, you can email me, DM me on Twitter. Info is right there. By also talking about transit's power and function in US urban history. And the question is, what do urban historians have to say about American transit? And how does it relate to historical themes and consequences? A couple of keynote works that might be exciting for some of you guys to look at and think about, I thought I might suggest here today. And what's most important to note across the works that I'm choosing to highlight here, which you'll also see across my research, is that urban historians rarely examine infrastructure in the past without employing the stories and struggles of people of color, women, and incarcerated Americans. Histories of the oppressed make up the bulk of urban history, since urban landscapes are considered in the historical view battles over liberation, white supremacy, and societal control. So you'll see across these notable works that the urban core and transit histories are about the damaging physical employment of white supremacy just as much as they are about the average people who contest those legacy. Our historians view infrastructure history as a physical extensions of the persistence of unequal landscapes. Robin Kelly's Race Rebels, which has a chapter about public transit in Atlanta in the late 20th century, in which he argues that African-American bus riders use bus spaces as a place to express fashion, hairstyle, and music choices. And so for Kelly, in the historical view, buses were a place of artistic creativity and liberation outside the purview of white people who normally drove and didn't take public busing. So for instance, someone like Kelly would consider transit spaces to be liberatory and creative spaces of Black invention. And historians like Eugene McCann, in his article, Race, Protest, and Public Space, is talking about the police murder of Tony Sullivan in the summer of 1994. And without public transportation at their disposal in Lexington, Kentucky, African-American residents of the Bluegrass Aspendale housing complex marched from their downtown neighborhood to protest the murder, and thereby put themselves in the way of police violence by walking out in the open as pedestrians rather than busing to the downtown. And so in the absence of public transit to shield them from tear gas, protesters risked health and safety in their attempts at pushing reform. So historical binary between how historians consider landscapes in which residents have access to transit and landscapes in which residents do not have access. Works that you may be interested in that I won't go into detail about today also mimic the boundary between what happens in unequal cities when public transport is available and versus when it's not. Steen and Andrew Carroll's works are good historical studies on urban segregation that is available. It almost always can aid in liberatory protest and can be used very effectively to contest physical expressions of white supremacy. So I just thought that I would suggest those to you all if you're interested in further reading. In terms of the historical placement of transit and liberation theory, I'd like to tell you a bit about a project I worked on in 2019 and some of my research. While I was a master's student at the University of Texas at San Antonio, I wanted really badly to write an urban history of that city, particularly because for most of the 19th and 20th century, San Antonio was a Jim Crow landscape. Also worked at the Institute of Texan Cultures, a museum that ended up being built on the site of the 1968 World's Fair. And it's that site that made me interested in urban history and made me want to write this project. In 1963, the city of San Antonio was chosen to host the World's Fair, for which they, of course, had to choose an actual fairgrounds. Happened in preparation for the Seattle World's Fair in 1962, the San Antonio Fair Committee had to slate a downtown neighborhood for demolition in order for the event to take place close to downtown. Incorporated even hired the same project manager for its neighborhood demolition that had worked on the Seattle World's Fair neighborhood demolition site. His name was Eddie Carlson. Pictured here on the right is City Lot 202, which at the time before demolition was a vibrant Mexican American, German, and Jewish working class neighborhood, which was later demolished to become the fairground starting in 1966. As you can see, despite Jim Crow's segregation of city structures at large, sometimes multiracial working class neighborhoods did exist, and they represented the diverse possibilities of residential zones in the urban core prior to urban renewal and the rise of mass suburbia. I will note, however, that while multiracial, this neighborhood did not have many African-American residents who were normally segregated mostly to the east side of San Antonio. As most of you might be familiar with, urban renewal projects that required demolition, like the World's Fair project, often needed project zones to be designated as slums or blighted areas to validate the funding that cities had received for project and to be able to exercise the powers of eminent domain. Eminent domain to claim city control of the land thought to be depreciated to blight by the residents themselves, the Fair Committee was able to necessitate City Lot 202's demolition. It was officially designated as a slum. You can see here that it was actually a working class neighborhood with diverse religious expression. And you can see on some streets, cars are parked outside. Covered more evidence against this neighborhood slum distinction, including the existence of several German hardware stores, Mexican tortillerias or tortilla factories, local restaurants, boarding houses, and a Mexican and European immigrant community whose work for hire actually supported those local businesses. So not only am I morally contesting the designation of this area as a slum, I'm also like disproving the of that distinction in itself. The slum designation was easy for the Fair Committee to push through city government, and they cited large immigrant populations, unmown lawns, and multifamily households as sign of urban blight and poverty in the area. Racist ideas about the unsuitability of Mexican immigrants near the proposed project site especially worried the Fair Committee, who thought it best to demolish the neighborhood and rebuild replacement affordable housing on the west side of the city, where they would relocate residents. The new affordable housing which was built was also designated by race. Chicanos and Mexican migrants were relocated to the Alazan Apache courts, and African American residents were relocated to Lincoln Heights. So they were also named in accordance to who would end up living there. I have a picture of some of the documents I went through during my research. This is the file for the Mexican American run restaurant Kinky and Nando's, which here you can see it's tagged upside down, but under the paperclip 202 Kinky and Nando's to be demolished. On the other side of the file, which you can't see here, is a single orange sticker, which marks the classic color identification system, which has later become known as redlining. Orange, in this case, denoted that the building was slated for demolition, but hadn't been torn down at the time that the document was actually created. Even if it was easy for the city to mark City Lot 202 and use as a slum and use eminent domain to be able to decide whether or not it be demolished, didn't the residents dissent? And of course they did, very much so. They protested at town hearings, they called the press, they wrote op-eds, and several private citizens even sued San Antonio Fair Incorporated. But when it came time to actually vote on the fair demolition project in the fall of 1964, there was a big problem. And that was because the grandfather clause and the poll tax were not yet outlawed in the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And thus they were still in effect. So half of the neighborhood in the fall of 1964 could not legally vote in the official election about what would happen to their neighborhood. And so with no say over the fate of their home, San Antonio Fair Incorporated literally plowed ahead. In the aftermath, some residents reported having only 2 weeks notice before eviction. Others stayed until the police forcibly removed them. And those who were removed complained to the press that replacement housing was too expensive, far away from public busing and where they used to work, and had torn apart well-established family and friend networks in their old home. To urban renewal, which I'm sure like many of you are very familiar with, vastly outweighed the benefits. As I've touched on, it dramatically exacerbated racial segregated residential districts, which further stratified African American and Chicano neighborhoods from white ones, causing the foundations for residential segregation that proved actually too difficult to solve into the 1980s and the early 2000s. Generational effect of removal. However, the San Antonio World's Fair site also worsened existing floodplains and had really detrimental environmental effects. The neighborhood previously on the site had some trees and city drainage to manage seasonal flooding, but the fairgrounds is basically a giant parking lot set up next to the San Antonio River.
What David was trying to talk about was the IIJ, which is the Biden infrastructure.
All the San Antonio Riverwalk is managed by a system of levees to control river levels themselves. Those levees do not stop severe flash flooding across HemisFair Park. And so when the San Antonio Via Bus Service codified its transit routes in 1977, one of its major hurdles was flood management, which was still a problem without many solutions, actually. Especially as much of the gentrified downtown struggles with flash flooding across parking lots and flattened tourist areas. which don't have sufficient drainage still. Some of the museums now downtown have their own flood pumps, but it does little to help with the district with public transit and access, particularly under the age of climate change. Many of highly concreted areas experience heat indexes up to 20 degrees hotter than places without, exacerbating already present issues and trying to attract residents and tourists to downtown, particularly in South Central Texas, where issues of like vastly and quickly rising heat indexes are becoming like near year-round events. Also vastly expanded the legal power and the presence of the police over the downtown area. And during the project's management, the San Antonio Fair Incorporated frequently called the police to remove people who unknowingly entered the project site, residents returning for items they may have left behind, and police were also reported to have used dogs and batons to man the boundaries of the project site while it was under construction. In 1959, the Spanish-American newspaper La Prensa voiced its deep concerns about San Antonio PD building another headquarters downtown. Police violence and the further gentrification of that area. And most of their fears would be confirmed in the coming decades. In the 1960s, the SAPD also enforced very harsh vagrancy and loitering laws, contributed to forcing the disappearance and the arrest of low-income homeless and non-white downtown residents, particularly into the period of the war on drugs. The SAPD continued to heavily police the newly gentrified downtown along Via's bus route stops, also beginning in 1977. As in most cities, converged and diverged at major busing transfer points, which put low-income and non-white bus riders at particular risk of arrest and surveillance while getting on and off public transit. Instead of urban rehabilitation, the fair intensified police response to poverty and homelessness into the war on drugs era, which further signaled that police networks and the rise of mass incarceration were part of the neoliberal reformation of city control going. Of policing also converged with issues of housing and transit in San Antonio. Economic and racially diverse residential districts closest to the downtown, making attractive places to eat, shop, and hang out spread further across San Antonio, which, as most of you know, has like an incredibly large urban sprawl. I can get there. Let me advance. Okay. And so where do all these conclusions leave us as we think about inequality in the urban core? Because the conditions that precipitated the problems of urban crisis in San Antonio are numerous, a coalition of reformers is needed to help us to get to the kind of urban spaces that so many of us actually envision in an ideal future, which across the day today at TransitCon, we've seen people talking about converging issues with transit as a way to solve problems. And that's one of the things that, of course, historians also advocate for. Making transit equitable, accessible, helpful, and efficient, as you can see from what I've been talking about today in these issues, isn't just about problems we relate most directly to transit. They're also about holistic urban experiences that make residents either likely or not likely to take advantage of public transit in the first place or support its mission at all. Urban residents who fear the police may respond differently to public transit than we might imagine if police continue to use transit entrance and exit points as places of surveillance, thereby making them dangerous for some commuters. Urban residents who transport across sprawl, which many of us do and many people do in San Antonio, may not trust busing infrastructure in particular during weather events worsened due to climate change. And as I've said today, in terms of racial residential housing segregation, formerly segregated neighborhoods of the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, like the south and west side of San Antonio, still do not have enough bus connectors to adequately serve the density of those neighborhoods. And it's now been 80 years. So in thinking about the complications of wealth gaps, this becomes particularly important in terms of job access. And so how do we overcome this? What does a fruitful or like diagnosis of problems produce for us? And I thought it would be helpful to showcase some of the ways that historians have contributed to the ongoing efforts of urban reform as they intersect with transit. Easement programs first, and I've linked to a program in DC called the LaFont Trust, which is an excellent example of this kind of reconstructive effort. A return to heavy investment in the urban core is necessary, as we've kind of been saying across this conference, and willingness to work with deficit spending may become critical, and it is used in conservation easement programs. Because the reality is that racial segregation in the housing market makes money for real estate agents, affluent residents, landlords, police, and some infrastructure bodies. 100 years, actually, residential segregation has been raucously profitable industry, which gleans on average 3 times the profit from low income and POC residents that they do through white and affluent people through faulty mortgages and inflated interest rates, which now some legislation stops it, but the effects on intergenerational wealth are continuing. And so conservation easement programs work homes and community centers. They restore them up to historic preservation standards, and they turn them into affordable housing, often in quickly gentrifying neighborhoods, and they attempt to stem the tide of gentrifying neighborhoods, which then push low-income residents out. In terms of geographies for remapping, there are historians who have contributed to expanding transit geographies, including Tara Hunter, whose work on East Atlanta, for example, discovered that the transit access that Black neighborhoods in East Atlanta had in 1997 were pretty much the same as they were in 1924. And so historians who do community work like that can point out places where transit geographies are actually not serving or underserving or are part of the divestment problem in communities of color. I'm going to go quickly here over the last 2 because I do know that I have about 6 minutes left. When considering police reform, I've linked Campaign Zero here, mostly because I think it's a good example of the way that anti-carceral activists and historians' demands on the state have made their way into activist language. So those of you who may be familiar with the work of Angela Davis, if you think about her work and then you look at the demands of Campaign Zero, I think it's interesting to note that carceral reform does pull pretty specifically from certain historians who are writing about functional ways to preserve communities and talk about lessening the effects of police brutality. And finally, when considering environmental perspectives and climate conscious solutions, there are historians like Michelle Desgenais, and I've linked her book, Metropolitan Natures here, in which she's talking about Metro Montreal, who point out areas in which both outside and inside of the urban core, suburbia has polluted much of the urban landscape. And she has given much advice to urban planners in Montreal about where environmental surveys need to take place in the future. So using historical knowledge to inform planners and activists in the present. Okay, and I know I only have 4 minutes left, and if anyone has questions, I would really like to hear them. So I would just like to say thank you for listening to my research today and about reform in the urban core. And yeah, so thank you so much. quickly. About JFK's arrival in 1968. The photo was taken actually a day before JFK's assassination, but it has a 1968 publication date on it because it was the date it was photocopied from the archive I got it from, if that makes sense. I do see a hand up. You can go ahead and ask your questions.
Yes, thank you for presenting this. And something that recently has been in my mind, speaking of the urban core and such, is this sense of, and I've been noticing this time and time again, and I find myself, and those of you who read City Observatory last year, it was even featured in the run-up to Juneteenth, about how it wasn't actually the riots and the massacres in the 1920s that undermined these Black neighborhoods, but it was really, and actually even Black Wall Street in Tulsa, that name did not come about until the 1950s, well after that instant. By then, they were still intact while Tulsa was gradually turning their downtown to a parking crater. And it took building a highway through Greenwood, that's the neighborhood, through there, that ultimately, that was amazing. That's what decimated them, because everything else, it wasn't the massacres of the 20s, survived depression better than most, still held together under redlining, and even with the post-war sprawl of Tulsa. And then lastly, it was the highway that did it. So how would you see us best shifting a narrative that this is not something we can just blame on those few people from a century ago, but rather it's something that is more systemic, that really has to be root and branch reform of organizations and institutions. So how would you recommend going about just reshaping that narrative, just offering that a much broader, just pushing back against that honestly disempowering mainstream narrative?
Adjusting the timeline in which we're thinking about when does racism exist on the timeline. And in your nice summary, actually, when asking your question, you have identified multiple places in the historical timeline in which racism occurs. And I think one of the things about the issues with highways, and like particularly in the aftermath of the 1954 Highway Act, I think what happens when I think historians and students think about the latter half of the 20th century, reputation of like a reckoning had happened and like an ending to the kind of like obvious structural racism in a way that it didn't actually. I will say what's helpful is that a lot of professional historians are good at pointing this out. But as many of you like would probably know, it is difficult when asking institutional bodies to take responsibility for certain building projects that take place and violate the rights of residents who are actually living there. So I don't know if I have any specific advice other than like from a historian's perspective, clarifying like when and where and how racism takes place on a timeline which is not static and which is continual is part of the project of like deconstructing like how and when structural racism takes place, and like reinserting this idea that it's not a victimless crime and it's actually not abstract, it's quite functional actually, and as I showed in my presentation, it's also very profitable. And so I think those are the ways like we can think about holding people responsible.